Hey everybody, it's Andy, and welcome again to my office in Modesto, California. I'm an attorney licensed to practice law in California as well as New York, and in this video, I'm going to try to answer the following question. Andy, why should I hire a private criminal defense attorney versus just going with a public defender? So somebody like this might be asking the question because they're facing a criminal case, misdemeanor, felony, whatever it is. Why should they hire a private defense attorney themselves versus just going with a public defender? So I'll give you my answer in this video, but I will qualify, kind of admit up front here that I do criminal defense as a practice area. So some of you will inevitably, kind of look at that and go like, oh, well, obviously he's going to tell you this. He's a defense attorney. What would you expect? So I think the logic that I apply in the answer that I'm about to give you is sound regardless. So I would encourage you just to listen to what I have to say, see if it applies in your situation. If you determine that it does apply, that the logic is sound, I would encourage you to look past the fact that a defense attorney told it to you. So that's all. So I guess to actually answer the question, my answer would be this. You need to look at the economics involved, not just the money, but I would encourage you to look at the incentives also. Economics, the field of economics, generally speaking, is not just about money, it's about incentives and how people respond to incentives. That's fundamentally what economics is. So if you look at the incentives, for example, that prosecutors have, that law enforcement officers have, this is what I think a lot of people would conclude. So there are many metrics that you can use to determine whether or not a particular law enforcement officer or a particular police department or sheriff's office, for example, in California, is effective. Whatever that means, whatever effective means. There are certain metrics that you could use to determine the effectiveness, right? You could look at, for example, community outreach, you could look at the crime rate, you could look at the number of arrests that are made in this department, for example. For better or worse, I think a lot of people will focus on crime rate as well as arrests rate, like the number of arrests, to determine whether or not a particular police department or sheriff's office or officer is doing a good job or a bad one. All right, so if you look at just that, then I would say that law enforcement officers, generally speaking, not specifically to any one law enforcement officer, making arrests is one way to demonstrate that they are doing a good job. So they have an incentive to make arrests, right? I'm generalizing here, but on the average, law enforcement officers and departments have an incentive to make arrests. If you look at prosecutors and you apply this same logic, prosecutors, at least in California, are elected officials. Like they elect one prosecutor, the electorate elects one prosecutor. That prosecutor has his or her own staff, and they hire people and so on. But fundamentally, the kind of big, the big dog, the chief of the office, I guess, generally speaking, is an elected official. So that elected official also has the incentive to file cases, for example, because they need to have a statistic that they can use to convince the electorate, hey, I'm doing a good job, re-elect me, right? So the prosecutor has an incentive to file new cases. Law enforcement officers have an incentive to arrest people for which the prosecutor can file new cases. So if you look at the defense side of the criminal justice system, if you look at the public defender's office, for example, in California, generally speaking, the public defender is going to be a county agency that has its own budget, has its own personnel, attorneys, and resources, and so on. So with one exception, I think that's true. The one exception I'm thinking of is San Mateo County in California. They have a private defender panel. So the thing is, the county hires private defense attorneys versus employing a public defender department, for example. So anyway, random aside. So if you look at the kind of steady stream of new cases that the prosecutor will be filing in any given week or in any given month, a lot of those, actually let me put it this way, not all of those new cases are going to involve private defenders, private defense attorneys rather. So the thing is, of all the people who are of all the new defendants, I guess, in criminal defense cases each week or month that the prosecutor files, a certain percentage of them, probably a lot of them, to be honest, will be going towards the public defender to seek their help, right? So the thing is, if you have a steady stream of new cases, new clients coming in your door, but you only have so much, budget and so many, personnel and stuff, so much bandwidth to work with those cases, you look at that and you go like, okay, it's not surprising that basically any given public defender only has 10 minutes, 5 minutes, whatever it is, to meet with their client. It's just math. Yeah. So the thing is, you have a steady stream of new cases coming in the door. You only have so many so many personnel, so much budget, and so on. Yeah, it's inevitable. I mean, the public defender, their whole point is that they can't say no to a new client. If they meet the eligibility criteria and stuff, the public defender's job is to provide legal counsel to those who would otherwise have no legal counsel, right? Yeah, so basically, if you're looking at the public defender and you're wondering why they only have 5 minutes, 10 minutes or something to spend with a new client, that's what, that's my theory about why that happens. Now, every public defender that I've ever dealt with, that I've ever met, they uniformly do a good job. They are tremendously overworked, but they are tremendously good at what they do also. They are working at 110% of capacity all the time, but they love it, basically. Yeah. So anyway, but the takeaway here is that the public defender, generally speaking, will help you, but because of resource limitations, because of the constant stream of new cases, you might only get 5, 10, maybe 15 minutes or something with each meeting with your public defender if you're one client out of 1,000 or something that they have. If you look at the private defense attorney kind of side of the coin, however, the big difference, I think, is that a private criminal defense attorney, one that you hire, has the ability to say no. The public defender generally can't say no to an eligible client who needs their services. A private defense attorney can say no. So they can turn away clients if, for example, the attorney determines that for the next month they're just too busy to handle new clients. They can turn clients away until they catch up again. The public defender, generally speaking, can't. So the reason why that's important is if you can afford it, obviously, and you hire your own attorney, you can meet with your attorney for 2 hours. If you can afford to do that, you can meet with your attorney for that amount of time and fully understand your case back to front, upside down, etc. If you can afford to do that, you can meet with your attorney so they can understand your position, all the facts, all your concerns. They can meet with your family too. If your mom, your dad, your wife, your spouse, whatever, has concerns about your criminal case and you can afford it, your private defense attorney will tell your spouse what they want to hear. They'll address your parents' concerns, all that stuff. With a public defender, chances are you're not going to be able to do that. They just don't have the time. Yeah, so I guess the difference then would be like public defenders, they can't say no to new clients. Private defense attorneys can. And provided you can afford it, the private defense attorney will help you, with your case, with past cases. They'll talk to your family, they'll talk to your spouse, etc. I say that because I've done it. So all that is premised, of course, on whether or not you can afford to have your criminal defense attorney, the one that you hire, whether or not you can afford to have them do that. If you can, great. But if you can't, you might have to do some consideration here about what's important, what's not, and so on. Yeah, so to kind of summarize, if all that made sense, there's incentives on the law enforcement side of the system, I guess. Officers, for example, have an incentive, I think, to arrest people to show that they're doing a good job, enforcing the law. Prosecutors have an incentive to file new cases to show the public that they are doing a good job and are worthy of re-election. On the defense side of the kind of system, that basically results in a steady stream of new criminal cases, new criminal defendants every week, every month, and so on. Statistically, I think a lot of those new defendants are going to need the public defender's help. And the public defender has eligibility requirements in terms of income, assets, and so on. But generally speaking, I think they're going to have a steady stream of new criminal defense cases coming in the door every week, every month, every quarter, and so on. And because the public defender doesn't have infinite budget, doesn't have infinite resources, infinite personnel, mathematically that has to lead to the situation where the individual public defender only has 5 minutes, 10 minutes, etc. to meet with their client before going to court. Like the public defender, generally speaking, is not going to have hours and hours to devote to a single case, for instance, unless the case is really extraordinary, like there's the death penalty or something involved. That's different. But the average kind of run-of-the-mill case, the public defender just doesn't have the time to spend hours and hours helping that particular defendant out. A private defense attorney, one that you pay for, has different incentives. So like I said, the private defense attorney can turn cases down if they need to because they're too busy, let's say. As long as the defendant, the client, can afford to pay, the private defense attorney will basically help you out, they'll help your spouse out, they'll help your family understand what's going through, and so on. All of that, unfortunately, is premised on whether or not you can actually afford to pay for that. But if you can, even if you stretch just a little bit, I think the bang for buck, so to speak, that you get by hiring a private defense attorney sometimes can be worth it. It's not guaranteed, of course, like there are no guarantees. Every case is different. But if you have a situation where you kind of know, for instance, that you might need a lot of hand-holding, that your spouse might need a lot of hand-holding, that you have questions about how your case will affect child support in another case that you have, or your parents have concerns or something, and if you can afford it, you generally will have those questions answered if you pay for your own attorney. If you have just a public defender, chances are they're not going to be able to talk to your spouse, your parents, help you out with a family law case, etc. So that, I think, is the big benefit of hiring your own defense attorney. Whether or not you can do it, that's entirely up to you. Whether or not you think the benefit is worth it, again, entirely up to you. But I think that's the benefit that you get, generally speaking, if you can stretch to hire your own defense attorney. So hopefully that made sense. Go ahead and rewatch this video if you want. Leave me a comment, share, like, subscribe, etc. And I will see you guys in the next video. Thanks.